There's a version of you that exists only in your native language, or in a language you know well. And then there's the version of you as a beginner language learner, reduced, stumbling, almost unrecognizable. This video is about what it's like to be that person.
When I decided to learn another language, I knew nothing of how to learn a language. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a vast, unfamiliar territory. I had no map, no guide, and no clear idea of what I was doing. I was excited, but also a little bit unsure. Things like learn the most common words first, listen and read a lot, or speak from day one sounded distant and abstract because I had no clear idea of what they actually meant. They were just a blurry sense of obviousness. Still, I imagined myself making incredible progress and, well, that confidence, even if it was a bit naive, was a good place to start. I started learning English in high school, and I got interested in it around 10th grade. Before that, I paid no attention to it. I didn't like it. This new interest allowed me to do well in the subject and pass without much problem. But my real interest came from wanting to read novels and listen to music. I still remember how badly I wanted to learn English so I could finally read Hemingway, Faulkner, listen to Red Hot Chili Peppers, Radiohead, Pearl Jam, and so on. This motivation was very strong at the time and made me spend hours learning by myself at home, just mindlessly watching YouTube videos that taught me
Grammar and vocabulary.
stumbling along the way. In a way, I was possessed by an obsession, and it was exciting to see how much I understood and also to understand something, to have that aha moment. It felt like collecting puzzle pieces or cards every time a new word or phrase was learned. That early vocabulary lingered on my mind, occupying parts of my day, because I repeated them, tried to combine them, made them stay. And when later I saw them in different contexts, they were like friends to get to know better as time goes on. I believe that falling in love with the language is a prerequisite for steady and rapid learning. It is the fuel of your efforts and the poetry of your learning sessions. If you like it and enjoy it, even your first days, especially these, are magical. Everything feels fresh and exciting. In fact, you are unaware of the great difficulties. You just see challenges and stepping stones, and so negative friction doesn't exist. But like any honeymoon phase, it doesn't last forever. Eventually, the novelty fades or motivation goes down a bit, and those challenges come onto the stage and ask for your attention. However, just as any serious boyfriend wants to commit and work through difficulties, you as a learner should find reasons to keep enjoying and keep learning, even when you are faced with the reality of the language. Before, it was fun to learn the basics, phrases to talk about yourself, your likes and dislikes, your free time. You were able to understand a few texts, audios, or videos, and your confidence was up. The language felt closer and kinder to you. But as you move beyond the basics, you're likely to have moments when you feel stuck, dumb, or confused. Grammar aspects, new vocabulary, ambiguities, pronunciation issues, forgetting stuff, the contrast between expectations and results. Those things will hit home and make you think, this is hard.
I want to understand.
But this is when you need to remember that a language is a vast territory, and not only vast, but full of things. Hitting a wall is normal. In fact, it might be a sign of progress because you're just beginning to understand the complexity of the language. Adapt and keep going because you have in your skull something powerful, something good at deciphering things and putting them together. When you start speaking, it's natural to become hyper aware of how you speak and sound. Your vocal tract is very much alive, so phonemes feel different, new, and novel. Some sounds are easy to make and they flow through. Others feel uncomfortable, and you have a harder time producing them. They feel like a person trying hard to squeeze through a narrow space. Another metaphor could be that of a crumbling building when you fail to make the sounds properly. And if you happen to record your voice, you may have a shock. It sounds weird. You don't fully recognize yourself in that mumbling, hesitating person with a muffled voice. That person is a beginner language learner. I remember how awkward speaking English felt at first. My native Spanish didn't prepare me for sounds like think, this, or the English R. On the other hand, sometimes you don't even notice sounds very well, and you may go on like that for some time until something or somebody points it out, leaving you both surprised and a bit embarrassed. I remember thinking that the word us was pronounced like us, because that's how I heard it in the song Karma Police by Radiohead, until the day I was corrected. However, my greatest battle was with the R sound at the beginning or end of a syllable. It felt like the least tangible of all, a sound hard to grasp like clouds or wind. But that wasn't the whole problem. The problem was that because of my cracking jaw, making the sound was difficult, and it came out as a sort of a Spanglish R, like R. This made me desperate and sad. I even thought I would never be able to articulate that sound well. And to make matters worse, I was convinced, truly convinced, that this impasse meant the impossibility of learning the language. Looking back, it's funny, but at the time, it really put me into hot water. Fortunately, I got back on track after finding my way around it and fixing my jaw issues. Besides, I also think that I was positioning my tongue incorrectly, and so, in a way, part of my problem was learned helplessness. Finally, when I broke the spell, it felt like the language gods had given me a second chance. That sound which had eluded me and caused me so much trouble finally became mine. Language is like a city, and words are its citizens. Verbs, nouns, adjectives, all working together to create meaning. But while 3,000 words might be enough for daily communication, even that can feel overwhelming when you're just beginning. In the beginning, you don't recognize patterns and nuances very well because of your limited vocabulary and grammar. You can consider yourself lucky if you understand a text about ordering food at a restaurant, you pick up a phrase about hobbies or favorite food, or say your name, nationality, and a few other things. These are the small victories of a beginner. Let's be honest, most of us forget words very quickly and for various reasons. The situation is even worse if you try to learn vocabulary without context. For example, by writing words down in a list that you abandon shortly after. And even if you don't abandon it, your comprehension will still be limited because the brain learns better by making connections. The more context you give it, sentences, stories, mental imagery, and so on, the better. While on your way to fluency, you're dying to dive into more interesting material, and this might create some conflict. Your vocabulary is small, your methods of learning words may be inefficient, and yet you feel that you are missing out on the big stuff, that you are just there lurking around and daydreaming of mastering the language. Besides, it may be that your input habits aren't that great. You're like a goat eating from here and there, not knowing what's best, what should be learned, leaving too much space for revision of vocabulary, or not revising at all. A As a learner of English, I used to feel impatient because I was so greedy, so desperate to learn the language, that I couldn't feel happy about forgetting vocabulary. It made me feel as though I was going backwards, that I was regressing. Words that I had learned just moments before were blurry, or nothing came to mind at all. And I wished that looking up a word once was enough. But that is for people with photographic memory, and I don't have that. And most people don't either. Well, yes, you can be very dumb when you are too greedy. You forget the most basic common sense. Vocabulary can be both an obstacle and a tool. It's an obstacle because not knowing enough words can hold you back from understanding the language. But it's also a tool because each word you learn unlocks more of it. How you see it depends on your perspective at any given moment. Yes, it's natural to want to dive into more exciting, advanced content, but impatience will only lead to stress and frustration, which in turn will leave your brain at stake, and learning will not happen as it should. Let's be clear, learning vocabulary as a beginner feels chaotic. It's like trying to grab a couple of candies from a piñata while hundreds spill around you. Imagine there is a group of friends talking, laughing and exchanging ideas while you watch from a distance, wanting to participate. That's how I understand listening as a beginner language learner. You just lurk around, you don't belong. Once in a while, you understand a word or two, maybe a small idea, but the full message, the connections between those ideas, remains hidden behind a wall of noise. Listening is one of the hardest parts of language learning. You marvel of how native speakers link their words together so effortlessly, while most of what they say flies over your head. Words don't sound the way you expect them to, and it's easy to feel lost. You sit down, play the video or audio, and the whole thing is both a paradoxically disjointed and jointed bunch of words, where a small number of them reveal themselves and many remain hidden. You hear them but don't know what they mean. They float unanchored and indistinctive, pure noise and gibberish. I often listened without subtitles and thought that what I was hearing was entirely new vocabulary, or at least that much of it was, only to discover later that most of those words were ones that I already knew. And sometimes a sense of failure came over me and made me wonder why I couldn't recognize them. On the other hand, there were moments when a phrase stood out clear and pristine, like an island, or like a piece of conversation you catch while passing by a group of people, only for it to return to muffled words as you walk away. In those moments, I felt connected. It felt as though my efforts had finally paid off. Those small victories often filled me with confidence and made me want to push further, searching for more difficult listening material and trying to discover where my limits of my comprehension were. As beginners, we often forget that words don't sound the same when they are spoken naturally. They connect, merge, lose sounds, and sometimes seem to transform altogether. A sentence like, "I'm going to have to do it later, but I don't know when," may sound more like, "I'm going to have to do it later, but I don't know when." The words are still there, but they were at different phase. In order to feel like I was speaking, I used to do shadowing. I looked like somebody on life support. As long as I was repeating after the audio, everything was fine. But as soon as I was left alone with my own resources, I went down. For me, speaking was the skill that came much later. And I don't mean speaking at a conversational level. I mean even producing simple sentences. The reason was simple. I never gave it much attention. I was focused on the other skills. But when I was finally forced to speak, so to speak, I felt compressed, reduced to broken sentences, blank moments, and calques from my native language, Spanish. A phenomenon which linguists call language interference or language transfer. On top of that, I had to translate from Spanish before speaking, and I took ages to produce even the simplest sentence. I don't know, translating while speaking is like seeing lightning and having to wait for the thunder. The thought appears instantly in your native language, but the words arrive much later in your target language. Speaking confronts you with the gap between expectation and reality more brutally than any other skill. The others don't leave you out in the open vulnerable. You can take your time when reading, you can work around what you hear when listening. Even your writing, full of grammar mistakes and misused words, can still carry meaning. But speaking happens in the moment. There's no pause button, no time to look things up, no opportunity to reorganize your thoughts, unless you're with your tutor, and even then you don't leave the experience unscathed. You're left there with what you know, what you remember, and what you can produce. Moreover, sometimes you naively think that your rehearsed phrases and hard-earned but insufficient understanding will enable you to express a few ideas. You enter a conversation or speaking session knowing that you won't be able to say much, but nevertheless not expecting to say so little and so poorly. Suddenly, your idea demands far more vocabulary and grammar than you possess. You try to bring it down, hold it tightly, and shape it into a coherent sentence. But in the end, you're left with an uncomfortable feeling of failure. This means that the limits of what you can do in the language are often much closer to shore than your imagined persona. Yet speaking also has its rewards. There are moments surprising, revealing, and deeply motivating when you manage to roll out a few ideas without much effort. A word, phrase, or grammatical structure that you weren't even aware you knew suddenly appears as naturally as an object placed into your hand. In those moments, you realize that all the reading and listening you've done has been quietly accumulating somewhere beneath the surface. Looking back, I think one of the hardest things about learning a language is how little you understand what is happening while it is happening. Most of the time, it feels as though nothing has changed. You forget words, struggle to understand people, mispronounce sounds, and fail to express ideas that seem simple in your native language. Yet, somehow, things accumulate. A word you learned months ago suddenly appears when you need it. A sound that once felt impossible becomes natural. A sentence that would have taken you a minute to produce comes easily, effortlessly. Little by little, the language stops feeling like a collection of rules and words and starts feeling like something alive. I think that as beginners, we often imagine that learning a language is about reaching a destination, fluency, mastery, confidence. But what I remember most is not any of those things. What I remember is a fascination of discovering a new way of expressing ideas. The frustration of not being able to say what I wanted, the small victories that felt much bigger than they probably were, and the gradual realization that I was becoming part of something that once felt completely foreign. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments what stage of language learning you're in, and how you have handled difficulties of any kind, and what your biggest win has been so far.